Welcome to Scotland is Now Race to Zero, a two-day conference brought to you by Team Scotland, a partnership approach led by Scottish Development International and Scottish Government in collaboration with city regions and key stakeholders. We hope that you've been able to join several of our sessions yesterday and earlier today and look forward to the sessions this afternoon. Full details of the programme and our fantastic speakers can be found on the conference website, www.scotlandracetozero.co.uk. I am Mary Henderson from Scottish Development International, and I'm here to introduce our next session, which is Creating Destinations and Successful Sustainable Places. And I'd now like to hand over to Michaela Sullivan, Chair of the Scottish Property Federation, who will be chairing the discussion. Michaela.
Thank you, Mary. This session is being supported by the Scottish Property Federation. And the Scottish Property Federation would like to thank SDI very much for inviting us to participate. I'm Michaela Sullivan and I am the current chair of the Scottish Property Federation. And this session today is going to look at two objectives: the need to create great destinations that are also sustainable at the same time. And as we need to reimagine, for example, some of our city centre spaces as society's habits change, we have some very key questions to address. These questions include: where are our future opportunities for growth and how the public and private sectors can work together, and the role that the growing build-to-rent sector will play, whether or not our offices and workplaces and so on will change over time. So here to wrestle with these thorny questions for you, we have a great panel today. We have David Partridge. David is the BPF, British Property Federation President, and is a senior partner in Argent. So he's led the regeneration of some very key spaces across the UK, and a leading architect has said of Argent, conformity is the enemy of progressive design. Argent have the vision to see past the predictable, to see the whole and to see it done well. So he's very well placed to speak to us on creating great destinations. We also have Barbara Cummins here today. And Barbara is a Scotland-wide acknowledged expert on historic buildings and is also the convener of the Royal Town Planning Institute in Scotland. So she's here today wearing her planning anorak, but I can say that because I've got one too. But she will also be able to consider some of these questions from the point of view of the historic character of some of our built environment that needs to be reimagined. We also have Miller Mathieson. Miller Mathieson heads CBRE in Scotland, and he's one of our leading experts in commercial property. And he's also my hero for repeatedly saying that he wants to go back to his office. And I absolutely share that feeling. I'm not a working from home fan. And we also have Stephen Lewis. Stephen Lewis is the MD of HFD, which is a progressive Scottish-based property group building workplaces for the future, bespoke offices, business parks, and so on and so forth. So again, he has a great perspective on how the world is going to change, the world of work is going to change. So that's our panel for today. We want this session to be interactive, and there are two things at the bottom. There's a chat function and a Q&A function. To get your questions answered, I'll be going to the Q&A. So please don't use the chat function, use the Q&A. Feel free at any point whilst our speakers are speaking to feed in your questions, so that as soon as we move on to the question and answer, we'll be ready for that. So without further ado, I shall move on. And we will ask the first question of our first panelist, which is David Partridge. So David, if you can turn your camera on and unmute yourself, ready to address the question: what are the key characteristics of a successful destination?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Michaela. And thank you very much indeed for that introduction and that interesting comment from a fellow architect. I'm actually an architect by training, as well as having headed up, as you say, Argent for some time, and we've been lucky to be involved in a lot of places, creating places all over all over the UK. Probably the most famous one that we're best known for at the moment is King's Cross. And in looking at trying to answer this question, actually, I went back to a document that we wrote scarily back in 2001, which was when we first won the opportunity to begin to sort of imagining what the King's Cross development would be. And back then we published a booklet which we called Principles for a Human City. And it set out 10 principles for what we considered were going to be the important things that should go into a city, which would be a place which would be, in the way we've described it today, truly sustainable and long-lasting. Some of those were about the process, which were to do with engaging, inspiring, and going through all the consultation, which we obviously had to do because this was about 5 or 6 years before we even gained planning permission and before we started. But the bits I think that are really relevant to today's conversation are around the actual creation of the destination, the place itself. And the most important one, I think, was one which was actually principle number 4, which was a vibrant mix of uses. It's really important, in my view, to ensure that for a place to be sustainable, for a place to last beyond the initial development phase, it needs to be a place that's not just monocultural. And so that's something that we've built into everything that we've done. So we've tried to create places where people will want to work, people will want to live, people will want to visit, they'll want to shop, there'll be restaurants, there'll be opportunities for them to do things at the weekend as well as during the week. So that vibrant mix, I think, is really, really, really key. The second thing is that mix should be within an urban, a very understandable urban framework, a place which is really accessible for people from all walks of life, a place where there's it's not elitist, it's not intended to be gentrified, it's open. I mean, one of the most wonderful things at King's Cross is seeing all the kids running around in fountains and enjoying themselves and they come from all around and they come from every different walk of life. So combined with that is the idea about creating opportunity for people. It's really important to ensure that the place is not just about an architectural approach, but one that is around activity, one that promotes a sense of community, an idea about longevity, which will encourage people to be involved, and then they will take that place over and they will begin to start owning it. And as soon as you get the feeling that a place is actually belonging to the people who enjoy using it rather than necessarily the people who might have actually created it or who have invested in it, then I think you've got the ingredients for a place which is truly sustainable. And then the final piece, I know our colleague will talk about this in a second, is around history and character and personality. And I think, again, this perhaps does come back to an architectural background, which is around trying to harness the value of the heritage of the place that you're working with, to try and look back at some of the good things about it, but also always be looking towards the future, looking to repurpose, looking to bring places up to date, looking to provide opportunities for new and contemporary architecture as well as everything, as well as taking advantage of the characteristics of the place itself. So all of those, I think, if you can bring them together, you can create a place that is truly sustainable. So sustainable not just in the environmental way, but sustainable because it's creating a community which will last. It's creating value which will be which will encourage investors, will encourage occupiers, and will encourage everybody in and around the area to come to. And I think if you can combine all of those things and sprinkle them around, then you've got a chance to certainly some building blocks, which I'm sure we can discuss with others, on how you then take those building blocks forward and build something out over time. Thank you.
Many thanks for that. Very thought-provoking, and yes, a place that people enjoy is very much something that we must aspire to. So I am going to now ask Barbara to unmute herself and join us to answer the question, what do you see as a sustainable place, and is this objective compatible with successful destinations? Barbara.
Thanks, Michaela, and I'm probably going to disappoint in terms of what I'm going to talk about, David, because I'm actually not going to major on heritage at all. There are lots of elements that make up a sustainable place, not just thinking about the built fabric, but physical and digital connectivity is key to supporting sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Our energy systems are integral to sustainability, and with Scottish Power estimating we need to quadruple the level of renewable energy production in Scotland to meet our climate targets. This has implications for our landscapes, our seascapes and transmission, from energy production to distribution. Anybody who's been involved in renewable energy projects will know that the communities affected are far and wide. We were unfortunate enough to upset a lot of people over the Bewley-Denny power line because it went through so many communities, but it's absolutely essential for the sustainability of places going forward. Flood risk has an impact, and sea level rise and coastal erosion on vulnerable communities, infrastructure and land, especially agricultural land. And that means we'll have to address the reality that communities and critical infrastructure may have to relocate within our lifetime because they're simply not sustainable. That means we also need to future-proof new development so that it can cope with these long-term effects. But I'd like to go back to the definition of what sustainability is: meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. It's often described as having three pillars: people, planet, profits. And we need all of these to align. And that's just as David said, you put people at the heart of it as well to make a successful, sustainable place. I'd also suggest you need to factor in time to the equation. A sustainable place is not static. All sorts of things change over time, and so must places to respond to that context. Who'd have thought when we started out in our careers, you didn't need to go into the office to work, yet most of us have been doing that for the past year. What does that do to our vision of a sustainable place going forward? Planning and placemaking, which is what I'm here to represent, tend to focus on and favour the new. We need to change that narrative, and just as David also said about valuing what we've got, talk about place sustaining, using what we have and building on it, both to make it more resilient and to secure what's special about places for future generations, and special as places to want to invest in. We need to be wary of the unintended consequences of not joining up those different elements that make up a place. And that's something that I think David has achieved really well in King's Cross. It's an area I have visited over many years to see it evolve. COVID-19 has also allowed us to appreciate the importance of the places we live in. A more coordinated approach across government will allow us to create the 20-minute neighbourhoods that RTPI Scotland has been promoting. That's a bit of a shorthand headline, the 20-minute neighbourhood, but all it really means is well-designed, attractive, healthy and sustainable communities where people have local access to the services, shops and facilities they need on a daily basis. So it's probably the right development in the right place, which is what we used to talk about years ago. So the idea of a 20-minute neighbourhood as a notion of what makes a sustainable place, it's a catch-all, but don't get hung up on the headline. It will mean different things in different contexts, and we're clearly going to be focusing on the urban here. Most of our towns and cities are in reality already made up of a series of interlinked villages and communities. During COVID, these are places where we've all lived, worked and played, and to a greater or lesser extent accessed services. The most successful of these places deliver most of our daily needs. That means they continue to function for their populations, make them an attractive place to live, and will therefore be looked after and make them attractive places for continued investment. People, planet, profit personified. Clearly I'm oversimplifying, but think about the places you want to live and invest in. What do they offer? A monoculture, as David has already highlighted, of housing or offices, or somewhere where homeowners and workers can also send their kids to school with a reasonable distance. You can get a pint of milk and a newspaper, if you're still old school, without getting in the car. So is the objective of a sustainable place compatible with successful destinations? Well, as you can tell, I see sustainable and successful as completely interlinked. As we look towards a green recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, Scotland's built environment professionals will play a key and pivotal role in tackling some of the most prominent domestic issues in Scotland. A coordinated and collaborative approach will provide the leadership and expertise that will help guide decision makers in ensuring a swift recovery and economic prosperity, and continue to make Scotland an attractive place to invest in. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll move on now to Miller Mathieson. And Miller is going to answer the question for us. Are we seeing strong overseas investor appetite for commercial property investment in Scotland? So Miller, if you can unmute yourself and join us, that would be great.
Thank you, Michaela, and afternoon to everyone. Great time to be asked about overseas investors when it's perhaps slightly impractical to consider flying in and out of our beautiful country right now. The pleasant surprise, however, is that international investors are actually still very active in our commercial property markets. In the last 5 years, we've seen overseas investors make up about 50% of the investment in our commercial markets, led mainly by German investors and American investors. Being slightly more city-specific, Glasgow has had just under 50% of the commercial investment in the last 5 years from overseas, whereas Edinburgh is slightly more than 50%. In the last 12 months, where you think it might change dramatically, actually, in 2020, of the 1.3 billion of transactions in Scotland in the commercial sector, almost exactly 50% of them were again involving overseas investors. So the simple answer to the question is yes, overseas investors are there. If you look at some of the biggest transactions in the last 18 months, you've had Korean money spending £133 million on an investment at Edinburgh Park. We've seen American money buying a building in Aberdeen for over £80 million. And we've just seen Singaporean money buying the Glasgow CBD. So that still continues. Indeed, right now, in terms of deals in the pipeline, we've got a German investor waiting very patiently to complete their inspections to complete a transaction in Edinburgh city centre for about 70 or 80 million. And just last night, Swedish equity completed on a Glasgow office building. So deals are continuing to happen, even with all the challenges we see around us. The reality also is, if a prime investment that ticks the future-proof boxes, and that's a big question mark, if a prime investment that ticks those boxes comes to the market, will there be overseas interest on top of domestic interest? Absolutely, there will. But the key thing is that criteria on how future-proof is that building. The international interest goes wider than the countries I've already mentioned. In the last few months, we've had inquiries from German, US, French, Korean, Israeli, Middle Eastern, South African, and even Argentinian investors. So there's no shortage of capital looking to invest here. Some of these parties have direct representation in the UK, so it's obvious who they are and what they are. But much of the overseas capital operates through asset managers and third parties in the UK, so it's perhaps not so obvious to everybody on the street. But why are they so keen to look? Well, fundamentally, the property basics in Scotland are actually very strong. If you look at the office sector, there is an acute shortage of future-proof Grade A offices in both Edinburgh and Glasgow, and therefore everybody knows that market is going to be strong going forward, despite all the challenges it's been facing. We've got an industrial sector that, relative to the rest of the UK, is actually quite immature. We've got a long way to go to catch up with the logistics sector and the logistics provision that we've seen elsewhere in the UK. Again, another major growth sector. And just sticking to the kind of core sectors, clearly there will be some challenges in the retail sector, but even in the retail warehousing sector, we've seen an uptick in investor interest. I expect to see a strong bounce back from the hospitality sector as and when they can come back in trading. There is a huge amount of capital moving around trying to work out whether they can snap up massive bargains in the hospitality sector, but right now the investors in that sector are holding firm, and I think their lenders are holding firm too because they know it should bounce back quite quickly. Both Edinburgh and Glasgow benefit massively from economic diversity nowadays. I think no longer are the two cities completely reliant on things like financial services. I believe that the renewables and the life sciences sector will offer economic opportunities as we go forward. The powerful message that comes, particularly through in Glasgow, we've seen some huge occupier deals done by the likes of Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, Virgin Money and others. What that does is demonstrate the power of having a strong and talented workforce, and I don't think we should underestimate that when it comes to investor appetite. We've also got very strong universities across the board in Scotland, and don't underestimate how important a benchmark that is when people are looking to invest in our country. So in conclusion, there continues to be very strong overseas interest in our best product. But to stay on theme with today's session, I think it is critical that the buildings that are being created going forward do tick the ESG boxes. If you look at the ESG criteria and the corporate social responsibility criteria that all the major investors have, whether they're UK domestic or overseas, or whether you're a UK major propco like Argent or British Land or Landsec, these companies all now have that as a top priority, and that will be a key thing going forward.
Thank you, Miller. That's a very positive message, and it leads us very neatly in talking about the type of spaces that people need to Stephen, who is going to address the question, do you see changed demands for new office products in the market following the experience of COVID-19 and its lockdowns? So Stephen, if you can unmute yourself and try and answer that question, that would be great. And for the audience, please feel free to continue to put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen.
Thanks.
Over to Stephen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess splitting this first into, I guess, a kind of quantitative demand as well as the qualitative part. I wrote a position paper to our board way back in April, post the first lockdown, which put some predictions on where I saw the market. I might have to wait to go back to 2001, David picking up his previous Argent document to see how close that was. But I talked at that point about a 10 to 15% reduction in overall demand for space. And that fits relatively well with some stats I've seen yesterday from CBRE's team, which talked about a 9% reduction over the next 3 years. But I think we need to look beyond that qualitative high level number to understand what that means between quality space or grade A space and grade B space. I think that will be acutely felt more significantly within the grade B space. And I think actually demand for there'll be a flight to quality. The demand for good quality space will actually increase. So whilst that might manifest itself as 10 to 15% overall, there will be a significant decrease for poorer quality space. And that's all because of the qualitative parts. I think in terms of that change demand in the question, I said right back at the start, as many others have, COVID has simply super accelerated a number of the trends that were already there. And if I touch on a couple of those to give some examples, agile working is not new. The forced agile working upon us and the work from home experiment we've had has just super accelerated that. And I think it's good to see that we're beyond some of the mass hysterics and the office is dead at the start, including some big corporates, Barclays, JP Morgan, even the tech firms, Apple and others, who have now suitably retrenched from those comments and understand and I guess never moved away from that, the value of the office and its role in collaboration and getting staff together. And I think everybody's feeling that. So agile working will absolutely increase, not just about how we use the space within the office itself, but how we use other locations, whether it's the home, whether it's coffee shops, whether it's client premises or whatever. And flexibility, again, which was there. We took our decision to put in our serviced office or our flexible office within our 177 development 4 years ago, way before COVID. But the demand for that hybrid space where occupiers take both long-term space, but mix that with some flexible space to meet their future change requirements is absolutely here. Historically, the perception was if your company was downsizing, it was negative. If it needed less space, it was a negative connotation. It's positive. It's about that move to agility and using the space in a different way. And buildings which are invariably fixed through lease structures need to provide that flexibility. The wellness agenda, not just specifically in relation to COVID, but generally has been accelerated as people understand what COVID has done to our health and how important health and, more importantly, well-being and our mental well-being is. I'm sure we're all sick and fed up of continuing to work from home and missing that collaboration. So wellness, thankfully, has actually been accelerated. Sustainability, and I couldn't agree more with Miller. I think the big change, and I let me change sustainability ESG in its widest sense, because it's clearly more than just sustainability, and to use Barbara's people, place, and people, planet, and profit stuff, it's now fundamentally been driven by occupiers. So I think the ability for developers to deliver it, because I am but a vessel, we just build what our occupiers want, and where that demand has been driven from the occupier, that'll absolutely be delivered by developers, and ergo it will be absolutely consumed by investors. And I think that's the fundamental. I think it's been not necessarily fully occupier driven throughout the whole market. And that is covering not just sustainability, but it's covering the social impact that our buildings have, how they sit in the community, how they interact with the community, very much what David touched at the start, and also about how we govern our projects and the companies that deliver them. Smart tech is weaved through all of this. It has an impact on wellness, efficiency, sustainability, but again, it's here. In service levels, when some of the more difficult to quantify. It's about not just the procuring of physical services, it's actually that experience that our occupiers demand within the space. And again, touching on some of the stuff that both David and Barbara have talked to, amenities are both within the building and out with the building. And in fact, there's a number of concentric rings there, but it's been able to go out and grab that paper and pint of milk, as Barbara talked about, but also have other spaces, whether it's nighttime economy, whether it's restaurants, within relatively close proximity. I'm not sure we're at the 20-minute city yet, but cities are by their very nature mixed use, and we need to get those mixes right. So offices will play a part of that, and they have to play a part in how they deliver the on-site amenities, whether that's external terrace space and a raft of others. I think there are a couple of specific COVID related changes. The need for buildings to develop touchless technology, so we're reducing the potential for viruses to spread. That flips into ventilation, the material choices that we have, and also some amendments on social distancing, future-proofing where we might have to be in the hopefully never to occur again future lockdowns. Let's stop at lockdown 3 and avoid lockdown 4 if we can. So yeah, ultimately, all of that will manifest itself in a flight to quality, occupiers using the space differently. The office will be a location to collaborate and get together with your colleagues. And it will still be used for single tasks. People still want to be in the office, but we'll use it differently. So it's a super acceleration of what's already been there, in summary.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stephen. So we're open to questions and answers now. As I say, continue to feed your questions in. I'm going to start with a question which I think I shall direct to David, if you can unmute yourself. Would you agree that in order to create great places that have a positive and sustained impact on the wider community, you also need patient long-term capital and motivated landowners, a true partnership?
Yeah, absolutely, I would. The question that I was answering was, what are the key characteristics of a successful destination? This one is about how do you actually achieve those? And I completely agree that it's really fundamental that the people who are involved in creating that destination come together from a number of different areas, and they could be in a absolutely formal partnership, or there will be a partnership of a series of stakeholders. And that partnership must come from the investors and long-term patient capital is absolutely essential in order to be able to take the time that's necessary to build up the multi-layers of everything that all the panelists have talked about today. And we've been really lucky, Argent in its history, working very closely with the British Telecom Pension Scheme, both at King's Cross and previously in Manchester and Birmingham and elsewhere, where we've been able to develop. They've been able to put behind us not just the capital itself, but also an understanding around the importance of ESG, which again has been mentioned today, the importance of ensuring that we are creating communities. It's also essential to be working very closely with local authorities as well. And I think, again, this is something whether it's absolutely a formal partnership or a partnership around, a general understanding of the needs of the place, and that's government, or it might be local government, it might be just local communities. It might be a local school, it might be a local hospital trust, or it might be, a university or whatever. Everybody needs to come together in order to be able to create win-win type situations, I think is the best way to describe it. I always talk about how we always look to create, to find the highest common factor between all stakeholders rather than the lowest common denominator. And I often find that the places that are most unsuccessful are the ones that have ended up sort of trying to be all things to all people, and have ended up just sort of as I say, finding that the bit that is least worst for everybody, as opposed to the bit that can create a sort of win-win for everyone. And I think that's the magic, that if you can achieve it, and if you've got the backing behind you to be able to take the time and to look at a holistic solution, where there may be some winners and losers in certain areas, rather than always trying to sort of squeeze the last pound out of every single element of the activity, then I think you've got a recipe for success.
Thank you. I think I'll direct the next question to Barbara, if I may, if you can unmute yourself, Barbara. The question is around the planning process and whether or not there is sufficient, shall we say, speed and inspiration in our planning departments, and does that run the risk of slowing down Scotland's recovery?
Thanks, Michaela. I suppose I could be defensive and say, how very dare you? I used to work for a planning authority myself, but you've got to acknowledge it varies across Scotland, but the approach from the development industry varies as well. And certainly on the big schemes that I've been involved with as a local authority planner, they involve collaboration with the site owner, the elements of the developer, and for that matter, the politicians, in understanding what the outcomes people were trying to achieve here. So it wasn't about stack 'em and rack 'em from the developer's perspective. It wasn't about stopping things happening from the local authorities' perspective. It was much more of that partnership approach. And I think if you approach things in that way, it's then about the quality of the outcome that you want to achieve. I've been asked in the past by a developer team to not put a case to a planning committee at a particular date, but to hold off to suit the timescale that they want. So it's possible that it works both ways. I know more often than not that's not the case, and we have to remember that planning in Scotland is a democratic process. So it goes into the local politicians to make those decisions, and quite often what a planning officer has to be when it comes to getting in front of a committee, once you're getting to a recommendation of approval, which is what we all want, is you're performing a bit of a sales pitch to members of the public who are lobbied from all sides. So I think there's a key thing here about the system and engaging at an early stage, so everybody understands what you're trying to achieve. I think for this audience, because we're talking about major investment, you're generally not talking about let's say, unallocated housing sites, which are going to be controversial, which are going to take a long time. You're talking about investing in our towns and cities on sites where that's what everybody wants to see. So it is possible that that can get a smooth run and an imaginative process. But it takes more than just the planning authority as well. I think it takes an understanding from the development industry. You won't always get the service that you deserve. Because we employ human beings in the planning system, and it will ultimately go to the politicians. But I think more often than not, it is a collaborative process, and I think it's generally getting better. And there's a broader understanding of what it is. This isn't about stopping things happening. It's about enabling development, and it's enabling the right development in the right place. And it might seem slow, but actually the planning process is not that slow when you take the overall length of the process itself. It's often said, oh, well, this is planning, but it's planning, it's building control, it's all of the other consents. It all gets lumped together. But I think planners have to recognise that as well. They're only a small part of that process, and the longer we take, the slower the process is and the more off-putting it is to investors. So I'm not going to agree that the process or that planners are uninspiring. We can be, but I think folk are trying very hard. And if developers are prepared to work with us, then you'll get a good service.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm very glad you didn't agree that planners are uninspiring, as I am one too. And I think that very core message about partnership is critical. And I think the more that all parts of the development process can work in partnership, the better off we will all be. The next question I'm going to turn to is for Miller. Miller, could you unmute yourself, please, and let us have some thoughts. Obviously, we're focusing on change and new development largely, but a significant chunk of our built estate is already here. And can you comment on the environmental credentials of the existing buildings and how perhaps we can reuse existing buildings in the future or bring them up to more environmentally friendly standards?
Oh, Miller Mathieson, the engineering expert, just about to speak. This should be entertaining. I think the key thing, I got a very interesting statistic just earlier this week that by 2050, the built environment will contain buildings, 2/3 of which are already built. So therefore, the retrofitting and future-proofing of the existing built environment is absolutely critical. The challenge there is the vast cost involved of enabling these buildings to meet the criteria that both occupiers and investors want going forward. There was a recent Scottish Government consultation paper on heating within buildings, one element of the overall equation suggesting that we will have to spend £33 billion on adapting the buildings purely to meet the heating situation. And that's in the commercial environment, as I understand it. So the challenge is massive. And therefore, that is the part of the equation that I think the world needs help with, because otherwise you're going to be left with buildings that people will not invest in. They will become a problem. And the key thing is you don't want to have to knock down to build back again. That's even more environmentally unfriendly. Therefore, what can you do to adapt the existing buildings? And heat is just one part of it, but the cost is huge. And I think the consultation that is going on to address that point, I think, is one of the most important bits of work that is currently going on in government.
Thank you, Miller. I'm going to ask the next question of Stephen. Stephen, if you can unmute yourself and see if you can answer for us. Do you see city centres continuing to dominate prime investment opportunities, or do you think the pandemic has changed this dynamic at all?
That's really a question for Miller. No, I'm only kidding. I think the same way that there'll be an occupational flight to quality, as Miller's already said, there is an investment flight to quality, and that encompasses the wider ESG position. So I don't think it actually matters whether we are in town or out of town. There's certainly been significant demand from investors out of town, not just around life sciences, which is an interesting little bubble just now, but out of town business parks generally. One of the bits I didn't touch on in terms of the changing demand for offices is the much talked about but little evidence seen on the kind of hub and spoke model, and moving away from a single large city centre HQ and having a 50% of that size, and then a number of spoke smaller offices closer to your employee base, which clearly has benefits from a commuting point of view, but I guess is questionable about again, depending on what teams need to come together at what point to collaborate. So, but again, in terms of this flexible and hybrid model, it might be a combination of both, but we're not seeing that in occupational take-up yet. So I think there will always be, and certainly overseas investors, I think, always like a trophy asset, like a big city centre, shiny office. So that demand will continue to be there. But I think there's definitely been a shift. And as a significant out-of-town business park owner, then we're delighted to see that coming back into favour. The kind of push for urbanisation out of business parks into the city centres, again, declined slightly from what it was previously.
Thank you very much.
Can I come back in on that, Michaela, if that's okay? Just
yes,
to add to Stephen's comments. I think it's not so much will there be a change of focus from city centre to out of town. The change of focus will be dictated by where people see occupier demand in the future. And as Stephen said right at the very outset, he will build product where he believes there is occupational demand, and he'll build it to the criteria that meets that demand. So I think investors will look where they see that occupier demand being sustainable going forward. If that means it's more out of town than CBD, then that is what will happen. The reality is, I think the out of town is a little bit further away, because the going back to the 20-minute communities or the amenities, those exist already in CBDs, and therefore that is where the natural strength and interest lies. Out of town at the moment has been driven by where people can find long income deals, and that's dictated the volume of transactions out of town. But to back up Stephen's point, we have seen a bit of an increase in out of town take up occupationally. We've seen quite a number of out of town lettings, and we are now seeing investors and propcos looking at business park investments for refurb opportunities, which was not something they were doing 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you, Miller. An interesting question now. I'm going to direct this to David, because I know this is something that has exercised the British Property Federation in the recent past, and it is something that we've talked about in the SPF as well. I'm a great one for reading the comments on the articles about new developments being proposed, and I can't help myself. I know that when I read the comments, they're going to say things like, where are the brown envelopes? But that is just something that we're up against. So the question that's come in is, developers have a trust issue. Do you agree, David?
Can I just chip in a little bit on the last question as well, just for a second, because I absolutely agree with the fact that there is going to be, a potential for a sort of recalibration. I also think that what's going to happen is that the conventional out of town kind of, office development or whatever it is, in itself is going to have to reinvent itself. It's going to have to become a neighborhood or a community in its own right. It can't be that monocultural office building with a whole bunch of car parking around it. And so I think that's what's going to drive the change. And then it really can become a hub or a spoke, whichever way you look at it. And I think you'll find, for instance, we're doing some work in sort of some zone 2, zone 3 areas of London where, we're creating real, almost we're calling them towns rather than city centre type developments, which again have all the characteristics that we've talked about. Let's come back to your point about trust. Yes, I absolutely. I mean, the British Property Federation conducted a bit of research a couple of years ago and came up with this the catchphrase around redefining real estate. It's not just developers who have a bad name, I'm afraid to say. It's the whole of the real estate industry And what was quite interesting actually was that most people who answered the questions around what did they think the real estate industry was. It was either an estate agent or someone who'd come to fix their plumbing or something like that. So you might have to sort of redefine the whole image of the real estate industry as what it really is. But clearly, people here on this particular webinar know what we're talking about. And I think it is essential for us too. It's not about just brown envelopes and camel hair coats and big cigars and all those sorts of characteristics of sort of Arthur Daly and the the sort of last decades of the last century. I think it's about us becoming more relevant, and today's subject is absolutely spot on. This is what redefining real estate is all about. It's about understanding what our customers really want. Where do people want to live? What sort of places do they want to work in? How far are they prepared to travel? What sort of values do they want to see from the brands that they're buying into? And whether that's a particular type of running gear, or a house that you're living in, or a city set, or a device that you're buying. Everybody's interested in what there's in the values that we all stand for, and so in the ESG that we've talked about is absolutely fundamental. It's about proving that we as an industry can provide places that are truly sustainable, that we're not raping and pillaging the planet in a way that perhaps we were characterized as doing in the past, and that we're doing it in an inclusive and diverse way, giving real opportunities to society, actually contributing back to society in the way that we have created cities over the last thousands of years. And understanding that and feeling a part of that and being embedded in that and not just sort of building it and disappearing. I think all of those are the things that's the way that we're going to get trust back, and we're going to get that. If we don't do that, we really will be seen to be the people who are the sort of leeches on society, as opposed to the people who are potentially providing the places for society to really flourish and thrive, which is fun. I'm sure fundamentally most of us, all of us who are in this industry, see it from that point of view. So that's yes, we do have to rebuild it. We have to rebuild it with actions rather than words. And I think we've got some great opportunities as we come out of COVID, as we begin to start rethinking how city centres are going to be rebuilt, how whether it's a city centre or a rural location, how town centres, how communities are going to be rebuilt, how neighbourhoods are going to be reimagined. This is the time for us to step up and prove that we can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Michaela, can I say a word or two as well on
please
trust? Yeah, because a former convener of the planning committee in Edinburgh reminded his fellow committee members at a point in time that it was developers who built the Edinburgh New Town. So I'm thinking maybe it just needs a rebrand. Developer is spat out like it's a dirty word. And how very dare you want to make profits, because of course you're doing this out of the good of your hearts and reaching into your own deep pockets to do things. I mean, it's actually facile the way sometimes the public perception is maybe a poor education system has something to do with that. Maybe it just needs a rebrand. Instead of developers, you're placemakers, because actually that's what this is all about.
Thank you. That's a good thought. We don't have time for many more questions, but the next question I was also going to direct to you, Barbara, and it sort of follows on from that, really. It's very much a people, planet, profit type question. And it is, out with city centres, do you think the value gap stymies placemaking, and how best should government overcome that?
Gosh, never mind out with city centres. If you look at the differences in values across Scotland, what you can achieve in Edinburgh compared to what you can achieve in Paisley, which is a forward-thinking, go-get-'em kind of place, completely different. For me, it's about, as much as anything, about a level playing field, and I don't think you get that. I think there is a kind of a one-size-fits-all applied right across the systems that people have to work within, and a quite a simplistic view sometimes taken from planners on that of course you can make money out of this, but it's got to be realistic. Maybe more of an open book approach would help with that, a little bit more sharing of knowledge and explaining what's involved in things. But I think it is a big issue, just that we've talked a lot about the cities in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but that you can't apply the same models right across Scotland. And I think that's probably where more of the partnership working between the public and the private sector comes in. We see it a lot in housing, with housing associations getting into partnership with housing providers. So maybe it's looking to models like that instead of a straightforward private sector investment.
Thank you. I want to leave time for closing remarks from everyone, so I'm just going to take one more question, and I'll direct it to Miller, because he knows he's not going to get away without me asking him another question. In the aim of carbon neutrality, what support do we need from government? Is it carrots, for example, an LBTT system aligned to EPC ratings, or sticks like harsher taxation on carbon-emitting energy systems, or should the market be left to find its own path? I don't think there's an answer to that question, but your thoughts.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that question, and whatever answer I come up with, I know that the person that submitted that question will think I've ducked the real answer. The reality is, if we leave it to the market to sort its own path, then we know we will not go down that path as quickly as we ought to. The flip side of that is, if you try and force it to happen through regulation and statutory interference, then there is the risk of you asking for unrealistic things to be achieved in unrealistic timetables. And that is always one of my biggest fears. We all go into these things with good intention and with the right ideas and principles of where we want to get to, but we then talk ourselves into timetables to deliver things that, given the current economic environment, are just not achievable. And I think it's a fine line between forcing people down a route, but making sure that it's realistic and there is support for people in order to achieve it. If you force people down that route and it's just not realistic, it just becomes a mess and nothing will happen. And I think that's the risk, that you get caught in that middle ground. You've got to have some clarity and support and help if you're going to ask people. For example, the retrofitting of buildings. It's not realistic for everybody to achieve everything in the next 7 or 8 years, which is almost what's going to be expected, unless there is significant assistance given.
Thank you, Miller. Much appreciated. Right, so I'm going to turn now to all the panellists and just give them a minute or so to give us their closing thoughts on the session today. And I'll go back to them in the order in which they spoke originally. So starting with David, please, if you could give us your closing thoughts.
Well, thanks very much. And first of all, just thanks to my colleagues for some really interesting comments and thoughts. Just as closing, for me, the key thing here is about measurement. We've talked a lot about how, a sustainable, what goes into a sustainable place, what it might look like and how we might achieve it and so on and so forth. For all of us who are here for the long run, I think we also need to have some sort of metric which we can all look at. We can begin to start measuring the E through looking at the environmental impact of what we do through measurement now around net zero and other aspects of the environmental side. What's much tougher is measuring the social impact of what we do, and therefore being able to compare notes with each other, to be able to see which things have worked and which things haven't, and therefore always to do better. And so I think if we can, as a real estate industry, as a group of people, can come up with some real metrics and some real examples of social value that we've created, social impact that we've had, then I think we can begin to start, A, showing what we're doing, and B, begin to start doing it better, and then C, change the perceptions that people have been talking about, because we can actually point to real impact and real positive opportunity and advancement for society at large. And then I think we'll have something which we can begin to start hanging our hats on for the future.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Barbara, your closing thoughts, please.
I would agree with David. And my takeaway from today is the little soundbite, a people-driven flight to quality. I love how that sounds, but then defining what we mean by quality. So what is that measurement of quality and social impact? So I'm not going to say anything more than the people-driven flight to quality. I love it.
Excellent, thank you. I like that too. Miller, your turn.
I think in very simple terms, focusing on the sustainability element of it, we have a very, very long way to go. However, I would suggest that don't underestimate how far we've already come in terms of the increasing prioritization of the ESG agenda. I think when you look at the agenda and the priorities of our major investors, our major developers, and also our major occupiers, it is top of the agenda in almost every boardroom around the country and overseas. And when you look at the benchmarking that's available in the real estate industry now against some of the environmental issues, I think we've come a long way. We shouldn't lose sight of that, but there is still a long way to go.
Excellent, thank you. And finally, Stephen, over to you for your closing thoughts, please.
Thanks, Michaela. There's a common theme here. I agree wholeheartedly with Miller and David. ESG, we're over the tipping point with ESG now, and certainly around sustainability, where it's no longer a choice, it's no longer a nice to have. Occupiers are demanding it, developers are delivering it, planning authorities are requiring it across the board. And I think, again, I fully agree with David. I think the best way to deal with the trust question is to educate people on what the property industry actually does, and as an industry, but also what it delivers, what its outputs are. And ESG is a fantastic way to do that. And we're being forced to do it, not forced to do it, actually we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And because we're doing it and we're measuring it, and I agree with David, it's difficult to measure the social value, we can then demonstrate it. And I think that'll help on a number of fronts. The uninspiring planning bit, just quickly to touch on that, I think whilst it is a mixed bag, and Barbara's right, there are some good examples, and we've talked about collaboration. We've recently set up a development forum in Glasgow through the Chamber with the City Council and the development community, the private sector development community, about how we work better together to drive better development in the city. And that's a fantastic demonstration of a public-private partnership, people coming together and knocking heads together, but collaboratively and positively about how we make things better. And that's where we have to start. And my final one is on the sustainability. We don't need that carrot or stick for sustainability. We're there already. But what I think we do need is more than just individual building interventions. We need to look at how we deliver holistic district heating systems, tidal power, and you can't do that in an individual development. You have to look at that across a city or across regions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So thank you to all our panelists. I think I've certainly really enjoyed this session and listening to you all. And I think our takeaway from it is around Barbara's point about people, planet and profit. There's obviously very positive messages coming through from Miller that investment is continuing in Scotland despite the COVID circumstances in which we find ourselves, and also that we have wide opportunities for new environments to be created, both reusing what we have and also creating great places that people will enjoy using. So there are some real positive impacts. I think there's no doubt that some government support will be needed to bring forward the green technology, the energy generation, the grid connections and so on that we need to lower carbon. But there's a very strong message that everybody has that message, and that is everybody's objective going forward. So I'm going to hand back to Mary, and she's going to close this session. But before I do, I'm going to invite you all to hang on to the thought that Miller has told us that the hospitality industry is expected to bounce back. So we should, with any luck, all find ourselves back in a more normal world in the fairly near future. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Mary.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you to the panel for an insightful and inspirational discussion. And thank you, audience, for joining and asking questions. We hope that you can join us for our final session taking place as part of our Scotland is Now Race to Zero 2-day conference. The programme for today's session is now on your screen, and the next and final session will be the city's countdown to COP at 3 p.m. The link to join the next panel is now in the Zoom chat, and your links for all sessions were in your interactive programme. Also in the programme in the Get in Touch section is the team email address. Please get in touch to speak with the team. We welcome inquiries from any investors, developers or stakeholders who are interested in projects mentioned over the course of the 2 days. And if you would like more information about investing in Scotland, please do get in touch. We look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you.